Mafia. He watched his best friend get shot. There are many sayings in different languages about how silence gives consent. In Italian, they say "chi non parla come il cassio," which literally translates to "he who does not speak is like cheese." The saying is used to describe how someone remains silent when they agree with something being said. But there are times when remaining silent can be fatal. That was certainly the case for one man who would later become a famous mafia boss. And it all happened because of his best friend. The year was 1963, and the place was New York City. A young man named Paul Vario was hanging out with his best friend, a man known only as Sonny. The two were drinking in a bar in the Little Italy, the neighborhood, when they decided to go to an underground poker game. The pair headed to a house where several men sat around a table playing cards. Paul had never been to this particular poker game before, but Sonny assured him that it was no big deal. As soon as they entered, however, Paul noticed something strange about the men at the table. They were all members of the Lucchese crime family, one of the 5 main families of the Mafia in the United States. Paul and Sonny sat down at the table and began playing. Everything seemed to be going well, until suddenly a fight broke out between 2 of the players. One of the men accused the other of cheating, and the argument quickly escalated into a shouting match. Before long, the men were standing up and fists were flying. The fight quickly attracted the attention of the other players, and soon the entire room was a scene of utter chaos. In the middle of the melee, one of the men pulled out a gun and fired several shots into the air to try and restore order. Everyone froze and looked towards the man with the gun. It was then that Paul realized he was in grave danger. The gun-wielding man stared directly at him, and Paul could feel his heart pounding in his chest. What did this guy want? Was he going to shoot him? Paul couldn't believe that things had escalated so quickly, and he was unsure what to do next. But as he stood there frozen in fear, he noticed something interesting about the man with the gun. The man's face was pale, and his hands were shaking slightly. It was clear that he was nervous and didn't want to hurt anyone. Realizing this gave Paul an idea. A moment of inspiration, Paul took a step forward and said, "Hey, don't shoot. I'll take the money." The man with the gun looked at Paul for a moment and then slowly lowered his weapon. "You sure?" he asked, his voice still shaky. Paul nodded his head vigorously, hoping that the man would trust him. "It's all right here," he said, gesturing to the table. "Take the money and let's forget about this." The man hesitated for a moment longer, but ultimately agreed. He picked up the money and ran out of the house. As soon as he was gone, the other men at the table also ran away. Left alone in the house, Paul turned to his friend Sonny and asked, "What the hell was that all about?" Sonny looked back at him with a mixture of anger and fear in his eyes. "Don't you recognize him?" he whispered. "That was Crazy Joe Gallo. He's a capo regime in the Lucchese crime family. Now he thinks that you stole from him." Paul was stunned. He had no idea that Sonny had set him up, and he was now in danger of becoming an enemy of the Mafia. Sonny tried to explain that he had no choice, but Paul wasn't having it. He was furious that his best friend had put him in such a dangerous situation. But there was nothing Paul could do now except wait for the inevitable. The next few weeks were filled with fear and uncertainty for Paul. He knew that Gallo and his men were looking for him, and he was sure that it was only a matter of time before they found him. Couldn't even leave his house without fearing that he would be followed or attacked. He became convinced that he was being watched at all times, and that any move he made could be his last. One evening, Paul was sitting in his car outside his house when he saw a group of men approaching him. They were led by Crazy Joe Gallo, and Paul knew that it was over. As the men closed in, Paul tried to start his car and drive away, but it was too late. Gallo and his men surrounded the vehicle and began banging on the hood. "Get out of the car, Vario," Gallo shouted. "We know you have the money. Hand it over and we'll let you go." Paul knew that there was no point in resisting. He had already lost. So he stepped out of the car and raised his hands in surrender. Gallo and his men searched the car and found the money that Paul had taken from the table. When they saw that it was all there, they were satisfied and let Paul go with a warning to stay out of their territory. From that moment on, Paul Vario knew that he could never go back to his old life. He had seen the power of the Mafia firsthand, and he was determined to make sure that it never got him again. He vowed to himself that he would do whatever it took to protect himself and his family from the dangers of the mob. And so began the story of how Paul Vario went from an ordinary citizen to a feared Mafia boss. In the years since the incident, Paul Vario has become one of the most powerful men in the Mafia. he has amassed a fortune through his criminal activities and has built a reputation as a ruthless and efficient crime boss. But despite all the power and money he has gained, Vario never forgot the lesson he learned from his best friend, Sonny. He knows that in the world of the Mafia, trust is a dangerous thing, and that even your closest friends can betray you. He also understands that the silence can be deafening, and that sometimes it is better to speak up and risk angering people than to remain silent and face the consequences. The betrayal by Sonny was a turning point in Vario's life. It forced him to make a decision: either submit to the power of the Mafia and live the rest of his life in fear and uncertainty, or fight back and try to take control of his own destiny. Vario chose the latter, and his decision paid off. He rose through the ranks of the Mafia and eventually became one of the most successful crime bosses of all time. However, it wasn't all smooth sailing. There were times when Vario almost lost everything. For example, in 1980, he was arrested on drug charges and sentenced to 5 years in prison. But even behind bars, Vario continued to run his criminal empire, and he was able to avoid becoming a rat, which is Mafia slang for a snitch. Upon his release from prison, Vario was greeted as a hero by his fellow mobsters, and he was given even more power and respect. Today, Paul Vario is a legend in the Mafia world. His story is often told and retold, and his name is synonymous with power and success. However, it is important to remember that Vario's rise to power came at a cost. He had to make some truly difficult decisions and sacrifices along the way. In the end, though, it was these decisions that made him the man he is today. As for Sonny, Vario's former best friend, he disappeared from Vario's life after the incident with Crazy Joe Gallo. Some say that he went into witness protection, while others say that he was killed by Gallo's men. Whatever happened to him, Sonny is just a footnote in Mafia history now, while Vario's name is spoken with reverence and respect. So what can we learn from this story? Well, firstly, we can see the importance of choosing our friends carefully. In Vario's case, he trusted the wrong person, and it nearly cost him his life. Secondly, we can see the power of silence. By remaining silent, Vario allowed Gallo and his men to assume that he was guilty, which put him in even more danger. Finally, we can see the importance of taking action. Had Vario not taken control of the situation, he may have ended up dead at the hands of Crazy Joe Gallo. Instead, he took charge and was able to save himself. These lessons are important for us all to remember in our own lives. Thank you for watching.